This Operational Delivery Officer Apprenticeship webinar is aimed at preparing apprentices for endpoint assessment, specifically guidance for line managers. The aim of this webinar is to give a brief overview of the endpoint assessment elements, as well as offering tips on how to support apprentices and best practice with regard to projects and portfolios. Prior to Gateway on the Operational Delivery Officer Standard, apprentices must have achieved the mandatory qualifications. The two mandatory qualifications are Level 2 Award in Operational Delivery and the Level 3 Certificate in Operational Delivery. Apprentices must have also achieved a Level 2 Functional Skill or equivalent in English and Maths, and naturally, whilst on programme, will have produced a portfolio of evidence. Endpoint assessment duration of the Operational Delivery Officer Standard lasts a maximum of 6 months. The start date of that is when the apprentice passes through Endpoint Assessment Gateway. In order to get through Gateway, the apprentice would have ensured they've met all the occupational competence. This would be highlighted in the portfolio of evidence. They would have achieved the mandatory qualifications, the functional skills level 2 requirements, and between the apprentice, the training provider and the line manager, an agreement would be made that the apprentice is now appropriate to go through Gateway. Once this is made, the Gateway Declaration form would be completed by all three parties and submitted to City and Guilds. Endpoint assessment then consists of two different assessment methods. The first assessment method is a work-based project, which also incorporates a presentation, and off the back of that we'll also have a question and answer session. The second assessment method is a professional discussion, which is underpinned by the portfolio of evidence we mentioned previously. Let's look at that work-based project now in more detail. Unlike the portfolio of evidence, the project assessment method is actually compiled after the apprentice has gone through the Gateway process. The project subject, the title and the scope of said project must be agreed between you, the employer and the apprentice, and must be submitted to City and Guilds within 2 weeks after the Gateway process. City and Guilds independent endpoint assessor will look at the project subject, the title and scope, and will give a yes or no as to whether or not what's been submitted is appropriate. The project must be completed and submitted in a time frame of no longer than 18 weeks having gone through Gateway. However, the training provider might work to a shorter time frame. The project is accompanied by a report, and that report should be 2,500 words approximately. The work-based project and presentation must represent all the knowledge and behaviours in the standard assigned to that project. It's therefore imperative that the assessment plan is used to map against the evidence generated to ensure that all the KSBs are indeed evidenced. Once the project-based word report is submitted, it will be reviewed by an independent endpoint assessor to ensure that the knowledge, skills and behaviours associated to the project within the assessment plan are indeed inherent in the apprentice's practice. The project must cover all of those KSBs associated. So the projects then should show their use of different analytical development techniques in the workplace to identify and produce key findings and judgments in assessments, how the apprentice identified gaps and opportunities for further analysis, and how the apprentice engaged with clients, their own organisation and other interested parties, and should explain their own critical thinking in both their analysis and generation of their overall findings and recommendations. It's really important that an apprentice has the opportunity to carry out a project prior to Gateway. When a naturally occurring project does arise for an apprentice, ensure you discuss the project requirements with them and introduce the apprentice to the various workflows within your team and indeed the wider organisation. It'll provide them with the breadth of ideas required to successfully achieve the project assessment method after Gateway. Ensure the apprentice knows the assessment criteria required to be covered. Ask your training provider for a copy of the assessment plan if required. Once the apprentice passes Gateway, discuss and agree the project plan. It should follow the guidelines, it should be achievable within a given time frame, and it should provide sufficient evidence to map across to the knowledge, skills and behaviours. It should be a piece of work that your team or department can actually implement. Please remember the apprentice is carrying out a real-life project and therefore must have access to the resources required in order to be successful. Agree and allocate sufficient time for the apprentice to carry out all the activities required. Remember, the apprentice will need time to plan, carry out research and activities. For instance, contact internal and external customers, carry out interviews where needed, gather data, analyse and indeed write that final report. The apprentice in most cases will only have 6 to 8 weeks to do this after their Gateway submission. Remind them not to book holidays and do not allocate any additional workload during this time. It's a really good opportunity to use this time for scheduled off-the-job learning. Read the project report and give constructive feedback. Help the apprentice to analyse the project and map the potential evidence against the knowledge, skills and behaviours shown in the assessment plan. The project report is quite straightforward, and you'll see here an appropriate structure the apprentice can use. Naturally, it would start with an introduction covering the scope of the project and indeed the title. It would be followed by a background which would provide a summary of the reasons for undertaking the project. The apprentice would then highlight the aims and objectives of the project and the research and methodology of the project. They would then move on to outcomes, providing a review and an analysis of the apprentice's research, which would include discussions and feedback from stakeholders. Business implications, such as the impact of the proposal on the business or stakeholders, and the considerations to take into account after discussions with those said stakeholders. What are the recommendations of the project after it's been completed? The apprentice would put forward a proposal here for implementation. And then finally a conclusion. The apprentice would review the project and whether or not it was successful. They would then reflect upon the project, on their own performance, and say how they would do something different if they were to redo it. We're now going to show you some examples of project themes and titles on the next slide. This list is not exhaustive, and actually apprentices can draw from experiences within their own department and team. You, the line manager, are a key person to help find a suitable project based on the objectives and workload of your team, section or department. Use this opportunity to ask your apprentice to conduct a piece of work that will directly be beneficial to your organisation. The titles on the next slide are examples only. The project proposal submission sheet needs to be completed in order for the project to be approved. There are many example project themes and titles available. However, it's important to note that this list is not exhaustive and an apprentice does not need to choose one from this list. Process improvement projects could be based on areas such as ways of sharing good practice, or the upskilling staff and customers on technology, for example. Delivery of service projects could be based on areas such as issues relating to modes of delivery, or customer service for people with social needs. Communication strategy projects could be done on the impact on customers, such as internal or external communication, working with or in the community, working with stakeholders, or information collection and dissemination. Matrix working projects could be done on how to provide service or support to customers, such as improved collaboration across teams and departments, or multi-agency working. The work-based project is supported by a presentation. The presentation will be based on the project and provide an overview. For example, the project might be based on a need to solve a work-based problem, or to review an aspect of a working practice, or it might be to introduce a new way of working. The presentation itself will last for approximately 15 minutes with a 10% tolerance at the discretion of the independent endpoint assessor. This will then be followed by a mandatory 15-minute Q&A session, again with a 10% tolerance at the discretion of the independent assessor. You can see here an exemplar completed work-based project submission sheet. Ensure to take note of the different areas to ensure that your work-based project submission sheet follows the same guidelines. Now let's look at the second assessment method, a professional discussion underpinned by the portfolio of evidence. We're now going to offer guidance as to what types of evidence will go into a portfolio. Work performance evidence must be the main form of evidence gathered for the apprentice's portfolio. Different examples of performance will be required that show consistent performance at work. Please note that reflective accounts and self-evaluation are not to be included as evidence. The apprentice must state why they have used the evidence and how it meets the standards, and it should be authenticated by a credible person within the workplace, for example, a team leader or manager. Evidence must also show personal development throughout the whole period of the apprentice being on programme. Yours, managers, appraisals and reviews can be included to demonstrate progression, and evidence of projects, initiatives and working with other teams to share and obtain new skills can be used. Formats can of course include written, audio and video. There are many different types of evidence that can go into a portfolio. Examples of planning, for instance, could be about how they've planned workload, or how they've set targets, and have they achieved their goals. Personal development records could be covered by feedback from managers, CPD, and how they continuously improve. Reports or documents could also be used, such as how the apprentice has responded to customer needs, how they've solved problems through action logs or case notes, for example. Minutes of meetings with line managers, peers and stakeholders could also be used, alongside evidence of customer interaction, whether or not that's internal or external. For instance, how the apprentice has corresponded or has recorded meetings. Evidence of where they've shared good working practice and whether or not that's formal or informal can be used. Examples of this could be peer group discussions and team meetings. Observations and witness testimonies, providing quality customer service and quality of advice given, can be used. And examples of IT systems such as how the apprentice has used filing and information retrieval, selection and use of appropriate IT applications, and correctly applying security measures and reporting faulty equipment can all be used as evidence. Apprentices can produce evidence from their own job role. This list is not exhaustive. The portfolio of evidence is supported by a professional discussion. A professional discussion is a structured discussion between an apprentice and an independent endpoint assessor. The duration of this discussion will be 60 minutes, with a 10% tolerance level above 60 minutes. Learners may be able to apply for further time under the reasonable adjustments policy if this is evidenced prior to endpoint assessment. Once the endpoint assessment is completed, a grading decision will be made. The grading decision will either be a fail, a pass or a distinction. Please note that no merit grade is offered under this standard. Apprentices must pass both assessment methods, which are in turn worth 50% each to achieve a pass for overall. Apprentices aiming for distinction must achieve distinction grade in both assessment methods for an overall distinction. Now let's look at some feedback from lead independent assessors associated to the Operational Delivery Officer standard. Now let's look at the feedback from the lead independent assessors and drill down into the two different assessment methods as to why learners are not achieving a distinction grade. Let's start with the showcase portfolio. The pass descriptor says a pass grade is an indicator there were aspects of the standard and evidence in respects to quality, range and selection and depth which could have been developed further. Key areas where this is the case is 2.1 and 3.1. 2.1 looks at legislation, policy and procedure. This area is often quite weak. There's often little reference to the different legislations, policies and procedures in place, and whilst they might be referred to, they're not always explicit in name or application. Further detail is generally required then in order to be successful in this area at distinction level. You might want to go into further depth by applying the knowledge into real-life scenarios or how the learner has applied them appropriately within their job role. 2.1 and 3.1 looks at customers and customer service. There needs to be a clearer understanding of internal and external customers. This is a challenge with telephony, but the apprentice has to provide compelling evidence that the customer is the focus of all they do. They need to show how they provide customer service to the most in need and vulnerable. It is key that managers' evidence is verifiable. The names and signatures of managers and their role should not be redacted. Changing descriptor wording is frequently seen. It is therefore becoming the norm that apprentices give an explanation as to how they've met the standard, often in a statement at the end of each evidence set or in text boxes throughout the portfolio. They often just change some of the wording that was seen in the standard descriptor. We cannot verify many of the statements made. For example, 2.2, I work on the telephones giving support to a diverse range of customers who come from different communities, have different needs, rights and expectations. If we compare that to the criteria 2.2, customers, understanding the diverse range of customers and communities and their needs, rights and expectations from individuals to the biggest multinational businesses, you can see there's very little difference in the example used. Now let's drill down into the project method of assessment. While we recognise that not all projects can be implemented, there's often little or no comment as to how the projects could have been implemented to achieve the desired outcomes. Projects must show the impact, whether or not it's actual impact or perceived impacts that they would have had on customers, whether or not those customers are internal or external. Too often, this is weak in respects to the external customer, and further focus should be given. The basis of research must be provided, such as research in the form of data gathered, or if quantitative research is not undertaken, other types of research must be explained. For example, a review of specific policies and procedures would be appropriate. Reasons for decisions should be given. What were the other options for consideration and why were they not used? Evidence of planning is often weak within the project. Remember, all planning should be included. The project plan allows for this and is a key area of the assessment criteria. Often, it's not fully completed. Independent endpoint assessors are often seeing that evidence generated by apprentices does not meet the KSP sufficiently. Digging deeper, it's often the case that the apprentice's job role does not allow the apprentice to develop the correct evidence. If the apprentice's job role is limited, let's say due to COVID-19, you might want to think about how you can carousel the apprentice into different job roles. For instance, to deal with different types of customers, or to not always be on the phone. It might be that the apprentice can perform additional tasks or take part in various work streams if the apprentice is carouseled into a different job role. Projects are not always relevant to the apprentice's job role, and although this is allowed, it does seem to make it more difficult for the apprentice to generate the required evidence to meet the knowledge, skills and behaviours. Where possible, ensure the apprentice's project maps directly to their job role or the organisation. Now let's look at some of the supporting documents offered by City and Guilds. These are all available from your training provider or from the Operational Delivery Central team. Endpoint assessment packs by City and Guilds are vital to success. There are currently 2 versions. However, the majority of your apprentices will be on version 2. Version 2 has the code 9717. Once an apprentice is registered with City and Guilds, access to the exemplar material is given. Exemplar material sits in our Smart Screen platform. It covers areas of best practice within portfolios, presentations, professional discussions, and of course the work-based project. Ensure the apprentice and yourself has access to these exemplar materials at the earliest opportunity. We thank you for listening and hope that you found this webinar of use. If you have any further queries, please do not hesitate to get in touch.